Hello, friends. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. Today, I have the honor and privilege of being joined by Professor Thomas Ward. Professor Ward is a philosophy professor at Baylor University. His research focuses on the history of philosophy, especially in the Middle Ages. He is the author or translator of several works, including Ordered by Love, Divine Ideas, Treatise on the First Principles, and the book he is joining us today to discuss, After Stoicism. So, Professor Ward, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Brian.
I went to go purchase After Stoicism in preparation for having you on a couple weeks ago, and to my pleasant surprise, it was at the time sold out. So, congratulations on that. That seems like a good sign.
Thanks. Yeah, it's the publisher didn't quite know what people would make of the book, and so I think we were all surprised when it sold out faster than anyone expected.
Well, I went through and read the Kindle version, and having, read some of your other works, I kind of knew already why there would maybe be some kind of buzz around this particular work. Not that I was, responsible for setting any sails on fire for you previously, but I know at least 3 people who had purchased your Ordered by Love book on Blessed John Duns Scotus at my recommendation. I found that to be a unique work in its presentation of a man who's beloved, misunderstood, and in a sense kind of in need of a sort of modern reanalysis. So again, with a very impressive batting average of home runs here, Professor Ward has this time partnered with Word on Fire to bring us a work that I think you guys in my audience are going to really enjoy. I'm not sure with this live going out tonight if you guys would have time to get it for Christmas presents for loved ones, but you could maybe get it in time for New Year's party, conversation starters on New Year's Eve for you guys. Are they back? Are you aware, Professor? Are they back in stock?
The last I heard on Friday, there is a few more had shown up on Amazon. I think it really is literally they're like looking around the warehouse trying to find extra copies to make available. And then no official word yet on when they're actually going to be doing a reprinting. Word on Fire makes such physically beautiful books. They're not, it's not print on demand, so they can't just conjure up a few more physical copies. So hopefully it won't be too long. But yeah, right now, as of on Friday, I saw that or heard that there were about 100 plus copies to be found on Amazon.
So you guys, if you want to get that first print, go ahead. You've got time now. There's maybe that 100 copies still available. And to jump into it today, Professor, I was going to begin with, kind of maybe one of my own observations is that through most of history, it seems that the kind of people who rise to the level of historical significance, that is the ones that we remember, decades and centuries later, usually their place in that pantheon kind of makes sense. They typically, come from the noble class or from a warrior class, religious, and so on. And I think while modernity has, in many ways leveled out that playing field, in the medieval and the ancient worlds, the ones we remember and the reasons we remember, they typically get there by birth and status and et cetera. But I think occasionally, maybe rarely, someone kind of rises to the level of historical significance that kind of bucks the trend at first glance, anyways. And while he does come from a patrician family, reading his story, it almost seems like our subject today, Boethius, maybe exemplifies that kind of rare character who appears almost through sheer talent and fortitude, and maybe some luck. So my question, Professor, just by way of introduction, who is Boethius, and also what is this late? I guess we're very late in the ancient world, very early in the medieval world. What is this kind of world that he's entering into, just for some context?
Yeah, good. So as you mentioned, he's from a patrician family, one of the noblest, in fact, and married into a even more prestigious family. His father-in-law was Symmachus, whom Boethius describes as the great glory of the human race. What a relationship to have with your
Mm.
father-in-law. So he and his father before him and father-in-law were senators in Rome at a in many ways very difficult time for the Western Empire. In fact, there was no longer a Western Empire. There was the Gothic kingdom ruled by Theodoric, who had seized power from his predecessor Odoacer, and they both were Gothic Arians, so heretic Christians. So when we think about the barbarians, they weren't always pagan. They had been evangelized by Arians sometime before, after Nicaea, and so the situation was that Theodoric would allow for quite a bit of religious tolerance within his kingdom for most of his reign. Toward the end, he became stingy
Mm.
to the point of violence. But so in addition to this toleration, there was a kind of settled peace between the native Roman people and their ruling Gothic overlords. It doesn't. It's we shouldn't think here of Germans with clubs going around beating elegant Romans. It was a sort of peaceful time. It was not a peaceful time for the church, however. So there was one is a the 30-year schism between the East and West. It's known as the Acacian Schism. It has to do with, broadly speaking, the Monophysite controversy. What sort of language post-Chalcedonian Christians could use to accurately describe the two natures, and Boethius seems to have been concerned about that controversy, was in touch with people who were directly involved in reaching a settlement. This Acacian schism ended in 419, and Boethius died a few years later in notorious fashion. So he had been politically favored through the 4 teens into the early 420s. His sons were made consuls at kind of startlingly young ages in 421 or 2, I think. And so all signs were pointing to Boethius as a highly favored senator, but he was also involved in these theological controversies and eventually was accused of treason.
Hmm.
And the what is supposed to be treasonous is not totally clear, but it seems to have had something to do with either actual correspondence or rumored correspondence with the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople, with some sort of wish or intention to bring the Western kingdom back into the fold of the Roman Empire. Theodoric was alarmed. Emperor Justin in the East was persecuting Arians in his domain. And that seems to have really irked Theodoric. So he started to become quite nasty to the Catholics in his kingdom. And Boethius eventually, after his accusation, was convicted of treason and then spent some time in house arrest, where afterward he was brutally uh, executed by having leather cords or straps wrapped very tightly around his head. Some accounts say that his eyes popped out, and then he was beaten to death with a club after that. Um, as you know, he's most famous for what he did in prison, which was write a supremely wonderful work of philosophy and literature called the Consolation of Philosophy. But he had been a scholar for many years prior to that, had deep investigations into music theory and mathematics and philosophy, undertook a translation project of works of Aristotle, and hoped to do some Plato as well, never got around to it, wrote commentaries on Aristotle. And so these earlier writings really provided, it's hard to overstate their significance for the revival of liberal learning in Europe in the, say, the 12th century and beyond. Without that sort of preservation of the classical inheritance of ancient Greece, it's hard to know how badly off Europeans would have been when cultural conditions allowed for a revival of learning. So he's extremely important in that regard, even if he hadn't written what effectively became his bestseller, The Consolation of Philosophy, which proved to be hugely influential, not only in academic philosophy and theology, but in uh, pop culture, more broadly speaking, in the arts. You know, Chaucer, for example, was hugely influenced by Boethius, and we could talk, on and on and on about the
Mhm.
influence that he exerted in that way. But that's it. So he was a scholar and a statesman at the same time, and he seems to have done both pretty well. But he's, of course, uh, the reason why he has his world historical place, as you say, in the pantheon of great thinkers, is because of the consolation of philosophy.
So, as a precocious young man, he has access to some very fine tutors. It seems like he acquires quite a formidable education. Then makes a name for himself in the court. And whenever it's coming into out of the ancient world and into the early medieval period. Sometimes, like, parsing out the Roman families gets to be a bit of a nightmare for historians. But for him to, like, it's a very impressive thing for him to have worked his way up as he did. And so your work specifically here being titled After Stoicism, maybe before we go too deeply into the part that Boethius plays in this, could you maybe introduce us to the Stoics, sort of the maybe the good, the bad, and the ugly of who these people are?
Yeah, good. The book is called After Stoicism because the consolation of philosophy does bear a lot of marks of influence by Stoic authors. The Stoics began as a third century BC philosophical movement. Their founder was a guy named Zeno of Citium, who had had a sort of philosophical conversion experience. He was a wealthy and greedy merchant of cloth who lost a cargo of his goods, and kind of in a despondency, uh, took up the philosophical life. He started hanging out with some cynic philosophers, and before sort of developing his own system. And the basics, Zeno didn't found everything that's noteworthy about Stoicism, but the basics of the school that he founded is that, unsurprisingly, given his conversion story, that there is so much of life that is completely outside of our control. And if we place our hope for contentment or happiness on our ability to control external circumstances, we're bound to be disappointed because we can't have that sort of control over so many aspects of our lives. What we can control is what is up to our own wills. And that has to do, in many cases, simply with our reactions to things. When some good fortune or bad fortune comes your way, do you get giddy by the good fortune? Do you get despondent by the bad fortune? If so, you're going to be sort of rolling, riding this roller coaster of emotion, and your life won't have a contented stability. So the Stoics emphasize the cultivation of virtues, particularly the four cardinal virtues, as a way to gain a kind of self-mastery so that you can uh, retain a sort of tranquility across the whole of your life. And that's really what the Stoics aimed at as the highest good of human life, the avoidance of suffering through the cultivation of virtue. And I think there's much that is noble in that picture of the world. But I think Boethius's primary break with the Stoics has to do exactly with what the ultimate goal of human life is. And while he admires the Stoic emphasis on avoiding suffering, he, I think, improves on them by placing true happiness, joy, blessedness, beatitude as the ultimate end of human life.
Yeah, there's a real staying power with the Stoics. I mean, down through the ages, Chekhov said that the truth has a certain ring to it. And when we find, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations still creeping up and, Amazon bestsellers, still affecting, young men who want to make positive changes in their lives, centuries after it was penned, there's something I think real and tangible there. And this seems to be what Boethius comes to, like you were saying, as far as the goods within Stoicism. And I'm interested, by way of introduction, I wanted to bring attention to a section of your book where you discuss what I would say in my own words is sort of the oddity of philosophy as consolation. If you were to take like 50 random people on the streets and ask them, what things in your life console you, I doubt ne'er one would place philosophy at the top of that list. Yet here we have Boethius telling us of the consolation of philosophy. And, I recently did a video because, I've been thinking about the traditional view of suffering versus how modern therapeutic practices view it. And we really seem to have crossed a threshold at some point. I'm by no means an expert in the history of the progression of like psychoanalysis and these things, but at some point, it seems to have like turned a corner where through the process of therapy, through medications, and in some instances, in some countries now through things like medically assisted suicide, this philosophy, this foundation that they've built their practice on, seems to see suffering as a tumor to be removed. And whereas the traditional Catholic, and I think in so many ways the classical Stoic view, suffering is sort of a process maybe to be endured, be it for learning or purging. But there's like a redemptive aspect to it. And now reading your book, and I'm thinking about Boethius, where he's writing this work, and if Lady Philosophy were a modern therapist in, say, Canada or somewhere, she'd likely offer him a pill to fall into that eternal slumber to solve his problems. And I'm somehow convinced that our beliefs around the telos of suffering, if they're incorrect, if our like foundational beliefs are incorrect, then of course our approach to correcting it will be faulty. But in consolation, and I know this is like a major portion of the work, um, you maybe as best you can, how is suffering handled? What exactly is suffering per this character of Lady Philosophy, maybe in theory and in praxis?
Yeah, good. Yeah, this is of course a big theme, and there is a certain deal of overlap between the Stoics and Christianity on the value of suffering. I mean, it, there's a sort of tagline that is associated with the Stoics that Lady Philosophy repeats, that there's no circumstance, no fortune is bad except you deem it so. And what is meant by that is not that pain is an illusion, but when we think about what is good and bad for us, it's easy, especially under the influence of modern philosophers like John Stuart Mill, or even classical authors like someone like Lucretius, who simply identify pain and bad, evil. So what is it? What is badness? It's simply pain. There's nothing more to it than that. And so then goodness becomes like either the absence of pain or the presence of pleasure. Now, if you have that sort of view about what badness is, then yeah, simply to be in pain, to suffer in any way, you have to say tautologically that's bad for you. But if you prize apart pain and badness or wickedness, um, then you retain the ability to say, well, maybe some pain is good for us. Not maybe finally good for us, but but can have this positive effect on our lives. And the process of undergoing suffering, taken in the right way, with a certain kind of stoic solidity or Christian submission, Christian participation in the sufferings of Christ, understanding suffering as purgative. All of these outlooks, whether pagan, Stoic, or Christian theological, can help us to interpret our suffering in a way that we actually can come to see it as good for us.
Mhm.
Again, not finally good for us, but good for us on the path to some sort of state of blessedness or tranquility.
So another interesting thing, Professor, I recently finished a draft for a book that I've written on the process of enculturation in the ancient and modern worlds,
Mm.
and this idea of how much of the Hellenistic, or for that matter, any non-Judean philosophy that we could borrow from, and Boethius seems to be right in the middle of this controversy. Long before the scholastic university students were engaging Aristotle's worldview, seeking to synthesize it, and all the controversies that arose from that, we find Boethius, engaged in something similar. To the point that I have seen, some have questioned the sincerity of his Christianity. What conclusions do you draw from Boethius's works and the project he was engaged in? Was his Hellenizing tendencies a rejection of, or an incorporation slash enculturation into the Christian worldview?
Yeah, this is uh, an issue that we can see popping up over the centuries since Boethius's death. I think the earliest recorded is um, oh, what's the guy's name? Bovo of some. And I'm blanking on the precise location, but Henry Chadwick, in his wonderful book on Boethius, reports this abbot who was cautioning his monks about reading too much Boethius or being too attentive to Boethius. And then we see it again in the uh, Samuel Johnson line about how Boethius seems to have been more philosopher than Christian, and so on, and into the modern period, we have the Jesuit Herbert Thurston and his revision of Butler's Lives of the Saints, going after Boethius for some sort of perceived lack of sincerity. Well, so why does this recur throughout history? What did Boethius do to deserve it? And the basic answer is that if you know nothing else about Boethius except the Consolation of Philosophy, and you read it all the way through, would you come away thinking that the author of this book was a Christian, a committed Christian? And the answer is no. I think that on that point, the critics are right. There is nothing about the book that is unequivocally makes it the work of a Christian author. So what we have to do, I think, is read, if we want to have any sort of insight into Boethius's faith commitment, we have to read the Consolation of Philosophy in light of other things that Boethius wrote, and in light of what we know or surmise about his own life and actions. So it's important here to remember that in addition to the commentary work that I mentioned earlier and the Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius also wrote 5 short theological treatises, two of which have to do with complicated issues in Trinitarian formulae. One has to do with Christological formulation, written against the Monophysites and trying to articulate um, theological language that retains full Chalcedonian orthodoxy that some sort of on the fence monophysites might be able to subscribe to. Uh, you know, a really, I think, high level intellectual theological work, but also a kind of pastorally sensitive, conciliatory effort. The fourth of these theological tractates is just this beautiful articulation of the Christian faith, sort of through history, starting with the creation of the world, starting with the Christian doctrine of God, and then moving into biblical history through Genesis and Exodus and so on, leading up to Christ and Christ's founding of the church with his apostles and instituting the sacraments for the health of mankind. And not only is this fourth tractate theologically correct, it bears a kind of enthusiasm, as though the author, of course, is committed personally to this vision. And so when you take the theological writings and sort of read them, or read the Consolation of Philosophy with those in mind, that the author of the Consolation is also the author of these treatises, then I think the Christian character, the Consolation, is really comes into focus, because while it could be read by a non-Christian to his comfort without having to embrace the Christian faith, once you read it as the work of a Christian, you see the account of God as the source of our happiness. You see the account of providence that is offered, and the preservation of free will, and the purpose of free will as enabling a loving union with God. You see all of these themes in the Consolation in their Christian context. And yeah, a mystical Platonist might be able to read the Consolation and get a lot out of it for his own like religious edification. Um, but I am without a doubt that it is a Christian work, and certainly the work of a Christian. And then I think there's also the value of tradition here. Boethius was venerated as a martyr in Pavia, the city in which he died, almost from the beginning. And there are contemporaries of Boethius who attest to this, Cassiodorus, for example. Um, and so, if we let tradition be our guide, there didn't seem to have been any concern amongst his Christian contemporaries. And I think that that should inform our own approach to Boethius as well, at least as Catholics.
Yeah, and this may just be the lot of Catholics from here to the eschaton, but going all the way back to like Tertullian and what does Athens to do with Jerusalem, up through even like Luther and his choice words for Aristotle. And then you have the university controversies in the 13th century around the reintroduction of Aristotle, as it were. Yeah, so I am personally of the belief that the Catholic teaching of natural theology and natural law has to have some practical implications. It can't just be this like nice thing that we give lip service to on paper. So when you turn to something like the Consolation of Philosophy, I think maybe part of this is just me maybe speculating a little bit, but maybe part of the problem is that we have this tendency to have a little bit of hindsight bias where when we're looking back on someone's life, like what is the context of Boethius writing a work like the Consolation of Philosophy? And like you said, you can't necessarily divorce that from the context of his life as a whole. So if you're just sort of isolating this one particular work with the scope of what he was doing, and you see this, I think a famous example, I think, is kind of what people have done with Thomas's Summa. He had a very like clear intention, and you kind of have to read the intention of what the Summa was in the context of the time it is written. Now, granted, the church has made like sort of there's been sort of magisterial pronouncements about the Summa in subsequent times since, so it's not a one-to-one comparison. But I think as like historians, we always need to keep the context of the life of the person and I'm not a I'm not a huge fan of Tolkien. I know that you bring up Tolkien quite a bit in your work, but I do think that Tolkien makes a good point sometimes. And this, his obviously the thing that he's looking at it through is the lens of storytelling. And you'll see critics of Tolkien come along who will say, "Well, where's like that blatant Christianity in Tolkien? Like I'm looking for it." And I think Tolkien has a point when he's saying, sometimes there is a value to just telling a good story. And you could have a foundation of like Christianity within that good story, but the story should be kind of standalone too. And honestly, Professor Ward, I don't know if this is too far afield, but I feel like that is a little more, maybe not even a little more, like significantly more um, effective to like even say like a modern culture, where if Tolkien came as explicitly Christian, I don't know if he would necessarily have had the effect that he has had in the last 70 or so years since his works were published. And maybe the same thing for something like the Consolation of Philosophy, right? Like if people sort of take this as like a standalone, um I could see it easily as being an introduction into Catholic ethics as such.
Yeah, what a wonderful comparison. For all of my love of Tolkien, I hadn't actually thought about that, but I think it actually is extremely apt. Both at both points you make. So one point that you might make about Tolkien is if you're if you've been told that it's the work of this devoted Catholic and that he himself thought of it as a Christian work, and you go and you read the Lord of the Rings, he's like, "What? Where is it? Tell show it to me." So that point, and then also this idea of a kind of almost like a Trojan horse of or an arc. Maybe an arc would
Mhm.
be better, where you sort of preserve some sort of cultural inheritance, and make it last, and maybe make it attractive to people who no longer find it intelligible. I think on both fronts, it's worth pondering more. But yeah, so I mean, with Boethius, the I think if a Christian storyteller like Tolkien um, gets a pass if he writes a really good tale that is not explicitly Christian but contains themes that have deep resonances with Christianity, if he gets a pass for doing that, and is even lauded for it, then shouldn't a philosopher who is a Catholic philosopher who writes a work of philosophy that has deep resonances with Christianity, shouldn't he get a pass for that or be lauded
Mhm.
for it? I think it's a wonderful analogy. And I do see Boethius that way. And then there's also, if you're really good at something, um, that's not sacred. Why not? Why can't you do it? So
Yeah.
I make the joke in the book, he's in prison. We don't know exactly how much time he had. We don't know what else he was up to, what else he might have planned to write. But he had all of this wisdom and knowledge stored up in his mind, and he just wrote this beautiful book as part of his whiling away the time, but also, of
Mhm.
course, more deeply working out some of his issues. Um, so there's that. And as far as the introduction to Catholic ethics, you're exactly right about that. I mean, so for example, Boethius gives this very powerful articulation of what is sometimes called the privation theory of evil, which Saint Augustine found so helpful to him in his own conversion. You could read about that in Confessions, Book 7. And the idea is that if the world is created and governed by God, who is all good, how can there be evil? And there's this powerful response, which is, in one sense, evil is nothing. There's no positive reality to evil. Evil instead is the corruption of originally good things. Um, the Consolation of Philosophy is a very powerful articulation of that. It is compatible with a pagan monotheism, but it is also compatible with Christian theism. Also, Boethius's emphasis on the virtues, the emphasis on happiness, uh, only being found in God, Boethius even has this almost mystical language of divinization, that to become happy is to become more godlike and vice versa. And so from that perspective, it sort of has the seeds of a Christian worldview. And to be honest, that's part of what I enjoyed about teaching it. I mean, I teach mostly Christian students here at Baylor University, but and not all Christian, but even the Christians are oftentimes not at all well formed in terms of having an overall intellectual vision of the world and
Mm.
the relation of their Sunday school lessons to the whole of their lives, to a sort of cosmic vision of Christianity. And so the consolation of philosophy can offer that in a way that doesn't feel like Sunday school or catechesis, because it's not being made from a position of religious authority, but instead of the beauty and the rational plausibility of its arguments and conclusions.
You brought up a actually where I wanted to go next, the very important question of happiness. And I think, Boethius, like any good philosopher, like any good Christian philosopher, comes around to the question of happiness. And it could easily take up the rest of the time that I have with you just talking about that. But one thing that I found, and my own particular work that I've done that I found interesting, is this concept of the images as reflections. One finds this in Maximus's Logi. One finds it in Bonaventure with the vestiges. This terminology that Bonaventure would use with vestiges as the sort of the footprints of God's working in creation, or he uses the analogy as a perspeculum, as a mirror. You touch upon this, and I was wondering if you could maybe introduce the um, listeners to the idea of images and how they pertain to happiness as such.
Yeah, good. I'll as you say, this is this is a big topic, but the way that maybe we can introduce this by the way that it comes out in the Consolation of Philosophy. So one of the uh, so the dramatic situation of the Consolation, as you know, is that the lady philosophy as a character is speaking with the character Boethius. So Boethius writes himself into this dialogue, and they're going back and forth. And Lady Philosophy has this early effort to detach Boethius from his love of transitory things or goods of fortune. You know, his former high status, his wealth, all his good health, all of that. To detach him from that so that he can focus on higher things. So there's this sort of destructive aspect. You know, you like all of these shiny things, you reject them. But then, you know, hopefully having achieved something with Boethius, she reintroduces these things now, not merely as obstacles to happiness, but as having the potential to direct Boethius toward what will make him truly happy. And that requires a sort of view of them and disposition toward them that sees them as useful, as having their place in our earthly lives here below, as making things more pleasant or easier and so on, but as being fundamentally unable to give us what they make us want. So they can't give us true happiness, but they spark the desire for true happiness. And so we can, while making use of them, also look through them to see the infinite good that they point us to. And of course, that is God. And so there's a kind of, you know, the Lady Philosophy holds out the possibility of living a life that is not completely in rejection of the goods of fortune, but embraces them in this sort of double sense as images to the highest good, but it also is as also good in themselves on their own turf. Like what they can actually do for us, that's good. Um, but more importantly, we ought to see them as sort of images of the divine. Now, there's a deeper sort of metaphysics here, which is like, well, why are these things images? And you mentioned the vestige and the footprint. You know, So what is going on here? And I think that the classical tradition, both in a certain kind of pagan monotheism, but well attested in Christian theology, as you mentioned, Maximus and Bonaventure, and many, many others, is that it's somehow the way in which all creatures image God so somehow falls out of the fact that not only is God the creator of everything, but that the very nature of things is somehow expressive of something about God. You know, there's not a kind of Platonic eternal realm of intelligibility that God has to consult to see what can be made. You know, it's all by attending to his own perfect act of being that God has ideas, divine ideas of every possible creature.
Mm.
And so in that sense, no matter what God makes, it's bound to, like, intrinsic to its very nature, have some sort of reference to its divine origin. And so in that sense, things are doubly dependent on God. They're dependent for their existence on God's creative act, but even dependent in some sense for their essence on on God, on the divine essence as their exemplar. And that metaphysical picture um, is there also in Consolation, though it's not as in the forefront of Lady Philosophy's program, and is not, I think, as well recognized by scholars as it should be, but it is there. And as you say, whether it's there or not, it has this huge attestation in the Christian theological tradition.
Mm, wonderful answer. Thank you for that. And I was going to say most of my own particular studies and interests, Professor, are in the high to late medieval period, especially around the rise of the university and the mendicant orders. So by the time you get to something like the Abbey of Bec, Bec being a Cluniac Reformed monastery, the base, and you touched upon this a little bit at the beginning, but the basis of their own curriculum was with coming from Lefranc up through Anselm, was grounded in Boethius's logic. So it's not like this person that we're talking about here. He can't be wrested from the wider context of everything that happens in later Western Latin developments. And I don't know if this is maybe getting too far afield here, but do you have any thoughts on the sort of lasting impact that Boethius was going to have basically on all subsequent scholastic learning? But if you want to sort of limit it to like high Middle Ages, what effect he would have on that, for example, just to kind of get us introduced to that.
Yeah, and this is yeah, good. I mean, it really is hard to overstate. I don't know as much as I ought to about the music and the mathematical works of Boethius, but I do know from historians that they were as influential or more in their fields as the logic and the commentary work um, was in its. So I mean, if you think about the impact here, the logic, as you mentioned, the preserving Aristarchus's mathematics and music theory, and presenting them in such a way that kept them intelligible. And one historian I read said that Boethius's treatise on music was still required reading for music students at Oxford University into the 19th century.
Wow.
Not as history of music, as a first founding a text of music theory. I mean, so in that sense, I think I know enough to know that I don't know anywhere close to the full impact of Boethius's work on subsequent Western intellectual history. But within logic, as you say, we can't have the 12th century um, renaissance or revolution in the study of logic as its own field, and the kind of metaphysical questions that arise from careful attention to logical issues. And in that sense, we can't have 13th century scholasticism without that Boethian foundation, and the efforts of places like the monastery at Beck to rekindle classical learning. When we think about the reintroduction of Aristotle in the very early 13th century, they were ready for it and they were hungry for it.
Mhm.
It's not like you just have these uh, ignoramuses wandering around and someone shows up on a boat with a bunch of books by a guy named Aristotle and they start reading them. Aristotle, the works of Aristotle were sought out because they knew that there was more than they had readily available, and what they were already reading was they recognized as being so important as a kind of research project or intellectual project to advance rather than simply to memorize all that Aristotle said and move on. So Boethius was central to that. And so even though we think of Aristotle as the most important guy for high scholasticism, which I think is undoubtedly correct, you can't actually get Aristotle having the influence that he had on the 13th century unless Boethius was there, through the Benedictines being taken really seriously and preserved and then taken seriously into the 12th century.
Yeah, and he was, from my understanding on this, and I couldn't tell you exactly. I know it was Aristotle's preservation of Aristotle's logic. It's a bit of a mischaracterization of the history to say that Aristotle was actually lost to the West.
Yes.
There was a corpus of his body that was lost. There was a part of his body that was lost, but what I think you're getting at there is there was a thread and a continuation that was unbroken, that was sort of the bedrock. It was like they were these. By the time you get to the development of the universities, like you're saying, you have these students that are eager for more, and the reason that they were eager for more is because they had been fed
Mhm.
already on this long-standing tradition of Boethius's logic. And yeah, I know it's one of those things that's a little like over. It's kind of a daunting task when you think about when you take I don't really like to engage in speculative history, but if you were to take somebody like Boethius out of the picture, like what even would the Middle Ages have been like? So, yeah, like with that kind of like pivotal character, to the whole subsequent, um, history of our philosophical and theological developments through the scholastic period. Yeah, you were. I think the right way to say it, as you were saying, is it's like it almost would sound like hyperbolic if you were trying to express just how important Boethius was, but it's not an over exaggeration if you were to remove his contributions, and as somebody who's a great lover of the entire scholastic period, it would have been a great tragedy to not have this man.
Yeah.
So speaking of his impact, I was delighted to see that you included a chapter on Boethius's argument for the existence of God. Boethius is among those elite philosophers who dare to venture into the argument from goodness, from that which can be deduced from coherent logical concepts or propositions, as opposed to the so-called cosmological arguments. You find it in Anselm, you find it in Scotus later. I feel like this is the area where angels fear to tread.
Mhm.
But I have to admit, Professor, that as I've over the years gained a greater appreciation for philosophy, this went from my least favorite to, as I have aged and refined in my thinking, to probably my favorite. And so, for the listeners, could you introduce us to Boethius's argument from goodness and maybe some of the later effect that would have on some of the other great thinkers?
Yeah, good. So I think the kind of premise that the argument starts from is itself maybe much more controversial today than it would have been for Boethius, and but there has to be this recognition that when we use the predicate good or goodness, that we are identifying facts about the way things are. Our concept of goodness is not something like our preferences or uh, uh, let alone some sort of identification of pleasure with goodness. To be good is to have some sort of status of nature fulfillment. And so for Boethius, it is as objective a thing or quality of things as anything else that say the scientists might take seriously as subject to empirical investigation. And that, I think, actually, despite the fact that there is a tendency to express skepticism about the objectivity of goodness nowadays, I think in practice, people actually aren't skeptics. And so I think the most helpful response, because there is this does have something of the status of a first principle. It's not the sort of thing that you can prove. It's the sort of thing by which you uh, do all of your practical reasoning. And so it's not the kind of thing like, oh, give me the argument for the reality of goodness. No, 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 no. Like, let me just show you how you already presume the reality of goodness, and that the whole of your life, your practical life, is unintelligible without your commitment to goodness. And so that's not a demonstration of the reality of goodness, but it's a kind of unfolding or revealing of what we're already committed to in our thinking and our practice. So from that premise that the good is real, we can recognize something like this: that when we identify this or that thing as good, we we know that there's nothing about that we know that all of the things that we identify as good are limited in their goodness. The a really good dog or a really good man, really good oak tree, they don't fully realize the full nature of goodness. Okay, and then we can also recognize that some things are better than others. That is, have more goodness or more perfectly exemplify goodness than other things. So, for example, a dog might be a good dog. You might be a good man, but you have more goodness than the dog. You're not only are you more valuable in the sense that I would prefer your flourishing to the dog's flourishing if they came into conflict, but I can recognize that you are just an overall more good thing than a dog. So if we start with the reality of goodness, the fact that things exemplify goodness in limited ways, the fact that some things are better than other things. From there, we can continue the thought that, well, what is this concept or standard of goodness that we make use of when we make these judgments about one thing being good, another thing being better than it, and so on? It has to be the concept of goodness as such. Goodness not limited in this or that way, just goodness with any possible limitation removed from it. And that helps us see that there is something intelligible about the idea of infinite goodness. Now, when we um, when we make use of our concept of goodness as such, in these judgments about things being good and so on, we attending just to that concept, either that concept is merely mental, something that I have kind of abstracted from all the good things, viciously abstracted, and it's sort of vague and hazy, and is merely a concept in my mind, or it itself is something like a form or a property that exists independently of my mind. And just as the natures of things are real natures and not up to my thinking about them, so too the goodness of things is some sort of sharing in goodness as such, not merely in some sort of hazy concept of goodness that I have. And that, I think, makes plausible the thought that goodness as such, infinite goodness, is real, is just as real as anything else, and in fact is the most real thing. Okay, so like if you could see yourself as getting on board with the idea of there being a real good, the good, then you get to God in roughly the following way. Our idea of God is of that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Well, either that than which nothing greater can be conceived uh, is the good, or it's not the good, but it's contradictory that it not be the good. So that than which nothing greater could be conceived is the good. We've already established that the good exists, therefore God exists. Um, that's really it. I mean, Boethius really compresses this. So what I've given is a kind of commentary unpacking, but as you mentioned, this argument gets I think improved on in later philosophers. I think you mentioned Anselm and Scotus, who I think are the two masters of this argument. I actually think that Scotus um, achieves maybe the height of natural theology by incorporating this argument into other natural theological techniques that he learned from other people like um, Henry of Ghent and some of the earlier Franciscans. But I mean, Boethius uh, launches this argument into the history of natural theology, and it really is powerful. And
Yeah,
I
and I
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm basically convinced by it at this
Mhm,
point. Some version of it.
mhm.
Yeah.
No, and I think there's a there's a tendency in and this maybe is not just limited to Catholic um, intra Catholic discussions. This might be the case in other um, faiths as well. But uh, whenever I have introduced people, I usually and historically have started with Anselm, but I need to actually go back now at this point and revisit Boethius maybe as the starting point. But when you introduce people to Anselm's argument, it's usually kind of an eye roll is like the first reaction, and that might even have been my own first reaction. But I think the problem is that we so often get caught up in this um, the apologetical nature of discussing these things, where whenever it almost feels like we feel like limited to make arguments that we could make against, say, a non-believer. But my personal shift was when somebody, I forget who it was, somebody had mentioned to me, well, why don't you just take Anselm on his own terms? Don't necessarily try to fit him in like a post-Humean, post-Kantian context. Take him on his own terms, see what he's engaging in. And I actually, that was sort of a ground shift for me, because I do think there's a while there's clearly a place for apologetics and the faith is always engaged in it, I actually think the faith does a much better job when there's a place for Catholics who maybe have like a principled foundational things that we agree on, and we're discussing these ideas amongst ourselves. And I think within that context, the argument from goodness is yeah, I mean, I'm convinced of it. I wouldn't necessarily use it to convince a non-believer, but again, I don't think that should be the be all and end all of the way that which we engage in our philosophical ventures.
Yeah, that's great. And that's actually for Anselm, that's something that um I think I've become more sensitive to that too. And this is now pretty important to me in teaching Anselm. I mean, if you look at the proslogion, the famous argument comes in the second chapter. The first chapter is a long prayer, and it addresses God under various attributes that are taken directly from Holy Scripture, and in particular the Psalms. And it's kind of placing Anselm himself, the petitioner, in relation to God under these attributes, as the source of his happiness. Anselm himself sees that he's so wretched in comparison to the greatness that God is, and so on and so forth. And then we get this expression, a request for God's help to find an argument that expresses the reality of God and everything we believe you, God, to be. And that's how Anselm introduces the formula. We believe that you are that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, why think that? Well, okay, he got it from Boethius. But in the context, why think that? Because that's what the Bible says God is.
Yeah.
And Anselm is praying the Psalms. I don't know if the practice would have been the whole Psalter daily or weekly or monthly. I'm not actually sure. It sounds like you might be, but in any case, he probably would have had the Psalms memorized
Mhm.
by the time he sits down to write Proslogion. And so to think of, I think it's important to think of that experience as informing what he thinks God is.
That's his famous, faith seeks understanding, which he got from Augustine. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Well, is there anything before we finish up, is there anything that you're working on, Professor, that people should be keeping an eye out for? Think you
You
want
know,
to?
I've kind of had to go back under the scholarly blanket and
Mm,
write some things that only a handful of people would be interested in. But you know, it's interesting just to kind of tout Boethius a little more here. You know, I've prior to writing this book, I had taught the Consolation of Philosophy a lot, but I hadn't really seen the Consolation of Philosophy as a text worthy of sort of deep structure, rigorous philosophical investigation that, say, scholastic thinkers like Aquinas and Duns Scotus invite. You know, but doing the deep dive for the book, kind of distilling everything that I have sort of experienced in the classroom, teaching Boethius and wanting to give that to a general audience. That sort of deep dive helped me see that there's actually a lot more depth, philosophical depth in the Consolation than first meets the eye. And that's so there's a scholarly project of just trying to tease out some of these things at a sort of a scholar's level of detail.
mhm,
But the beauty of that is that you know, the Consolation of Philosophy is accessible to most literate people. I mean, there are some parts that are hard, but it has a beauty to it. Uh, the arguments are, you know, not that hard to track. And so even if you're not accessing the full depths of it, it's still intelligible. And so that's so realizing that it actually is deep, 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 but still accessible. It just redounds all the more to Boethius's success as a writer.
Well, we really appreciate you. You kind of came onto the scene for me a couple years ago with the work that you did on John Duns Scotus, and I crossed the threshold into my 40s just a couple years ago, and so going back to when I was younger, which I assume you're probably closer to my age. Before we had access to all of this stuff, I think many of us lived in our own little like pockets, and if your content got out there to a few thousand people, you were doing really well. Where I'm still somewhat kind of catching up with the reality of what some of these like channels are capable of doing and how far the reach of some of this stuff gets. And I really feel like there's we probably won't see the fruit of it with all in our lifetime. But it almost seems like we're on the precipice of like kind of some kind of great revival. I don't know if you have experienced this, but like when I started this channel, and I'm doing deep dives into Bonaventure and into Scotus, and I never would have thought I had kind of the reaction that I've gotten from and then to turn, like I said, I was really pleasantly surprised to see that after Stoicism was sold out. So it feels like there's something in the air at the moment, and it's a kind of a wonderful time to be a part of this. So I really appreciate you, taking the time out of your life to put these works together for us.
Yeah, you know, thanks for saying that. And if I could venture something like a prophecy, you know, that if it doesn't come true, don't call me a false prophet. But I think we might be witnessing a kind of realignment of where philosophical learning is pursued and valued
Mhm,
away from colleges and universities and toward something more like these online communities and maybe IRL book groups or discussion
mhm,
groups that may form a sort of satellite to these. But where I find by far the most enthusiasm for the kind of study that I've engaged in and the kinds of work that I have tried to do for students. For it's no longer in the classroom. It's in, places like this,
Mhm.
and people who get in touch with me because they saw something like this or something you're doing, and they want to know more. So I think, with the rise of the university as a credentialing factory, with the cheating tools like ChatGPT for getting through a philosophy class without doing any philosophical reading. um, the morale among students for true liberal learning is so low. Um, of course, there are exceptions, right? But as a whole, and so instead, I find that the love of learning is somehow being preserved instead in these other contexts, and I think we're going to continue to see that.
Yeah, it's a great time to be alive.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for joining us, Professor. And I'd like to get you back on at some point, maybe when you have some time, because as a channel that's dedicated to Franciscan topics and some of your other published works, we'd love to get you back on for some of those conversations.
I'd love to, Brian. It's been great talking to you and meeting you for the first time this hour.
Likewise. God bless you.
Yeah, same.